November 23rd, 1943, 18:20 hours. Betio Island. First Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman Jr., 33, from New Mexico, climbed through the shattered entrance of what intelligence had called a simple bunker. His boots crunched on spent shell casings and coral dust. The concrete walls descended 15 feet into darkness. He'd seen fortifications before. Guadalcanal had pillboxes. Bougainville had trenches. This was different. The shaft dropped straight down, lined with steel rails. Electric cables snaked along the ceiling. The air smelled like copper and decay. What Bonnyman didn't know, beneath his feet lay 500 interconnected positions the Navy's bombardment hadn't touched. Within 48 hours, Marine engineers would map a subterranean fortress that changed everything about island warfare. The battle for Tarawa had ended 4 hours earlier. Major General Julian Smith stood on Red Beach 2, watching bulldozers push Japanese bodies into mass graves. His 2nd Marine Division had suffered 1,009 killed and 2,101 wounded, taking a strip of coral 800 yards wide. The casualty rate, nearly 20% in 76 hours, exceeded anything in Marine Corps' history. Smith had expected fortifications. Japanese Admiral Keiji Shibazaki had boasted that 1,000,000 men couldn't take Tarawa in 100 years. Intelligence photographs showed concrete bunkers thick enough to withstand 16-inch naval shells, but the photos captured only surface structures. What lay beneath remained invisible until Marines began clearing the island sector by sector. Sergeant Thomas Gahagan entered a bunker near the airfield's southern edge. The structure stretched 40 feet across, walls 4 feet thick, roof buried under 10 feet of sand and coconut logs. Naval gunfire had dented the concrete but failed to penetrate. Inside, he found ammunition stores, medical supplies, and a stairway leading down. The descent revealed a chamber 20 feet square. Wooden bunks lined 3 walls. A desk held Japanese documents and maps. But what stopped Gahagan was the doorway on the far side. Another passage, sloping deeper. He followed it 50 feet to a second chamber, then a third. The complex extended in multiple directions, each tunnel connecting to others. The numbers seemed impossible. Over 500 defensive positions, most connected underground. But post-battle surveys confirmed every detail. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, observing for V Amphibious Corps, walked the battlefield at dusk. He'd led the Makan raid a year earlier, studied Japanese defensive doctrine through captured documents. Nothing in those files suggested this level of engineering sophistication. The enemy had built an underground city designed to survive the heaviest bombardment the Navy could deliver. Marine patrols discovered the network's extent gradually. A bunker near Red Beach 3 connected to 5 others through tunnels radiating like spokes. Another complex under the airfield linked 14 positions across 300 yards. Japanese defenders had moved through these passages unseen, appearing in locations Marines had already cleared, attacking from unexpected angles. Captain James Crow led the 8th Marines Engineer Section. His teams spent 3 days mapping the primary tunnel system. The main arteries ran parallel to the beaches, 12 feet deep, reinforced with steel beams and concrete pillboxes every 40 yards. Secondary tunnels connected these arteries to observation posts, machine gun nests, and ammunition bunkers. The entire network covered 291 acres. Could American forces have anticipated this? The answer would reshape amphibious assault doctrine for the rest of the war. What Japanese 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force engineers documented. Subterranean positions provide complete protection from naval bombardment and aerial attack. The problem? Marine intelligence had no framework for detecting underground installations from aerial reconnaissance. Admiral Raymond Spruance reviewed preliminary reports aboard the Indianapolis. The Navy had fired 2,619 tons of shells at Betio over 3 hours before the landing. Carrier aircraft had dropped another 173 tons of bombs. Every visible bunker had been hit multiple times. Yet 4,500 Japanese defenders emerged from underground positions largely intact, manning weapons that should have been destroyed. The tactical implications rippled outward. If the Japanese could build such defenses on a coral atoll with limited resources, what awaited American forces on larger islands? Kwajalelin, Saipan, Iwo Jima, each offered more space, more materials, more time to fortify. The Central Pacific offensive suddenly looked far costlier than planners had projected. Bonnyman descended the shaft using a rope ladder. 2 Marines with flashlights followed. The passage at the bottom ran 80 feet before branching into 3 directions. The walls were smooth concrete, poured using forms that left no seams. Ventilation shafts, every 30 feet, connected to surface apertures camouflaged as natural coral formations. The left branch led to a command post. Maps covered one wall, showing Betio's defenses in precise detail. Radio equipment sat on tables connected to antenna wires that surfaced near the beach. The Japanese commander had directed the battle from 20 feet underground, immune to American firepower, seeing the battlefield through periscopes and observers in hardened positions. They believed their fortress was impregnable. They were catastrophically wrong about American willingness to pay the cost. The middle passage opened into a larger chamber, stacked with artillery shells and rifle ammunition. The 75mm guns that had shredded Marine landing craft on D-Day had fired from here, rolling out to fire through apertures in the beach defenses, then retreating underground before naval counter-battery fire could respond. The system allowed defenders to concentrate firepower at critical points without exposing themselves to American naval supremacy. Marine intelligence officers studied captured documents through the night. Japanese engineers had begun construction in August 1942, 15 months before the invasion. Labor teams, mostly Korean conscripts, had poured 6,000 cubic yards of concrete, installed 400 tons of steel reinforcement, and excavated 12,000 cubic yards of coral. The project had consumed resources equivalent to building a small city. Would American industry need to completely retool for a different kind of warfare? The question haunted every officer who walked through those tunnels. Major Henry Pearson Crowe commanded the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. His unit had taken the heaviest casualties on D-Day, 312 killed or wounded before reaching the seawall. He'd assumed murderous Japanese fire came from visible bunkers. The post-battle survey revealed otherwise. Machine gun nests that had decimated his companies connected underground to ammunition stores 100 yards away. When Marines destroyed one position with satchel charges, defenders simply retreated through tunnels and emerged elsewhere. The right branch descended another level. Bonnyman counted 42 steps carved into solid coral. This depth put them 30 feet below sea level. Water seeped through cracks in the concrete, pooling on the floor, but the structure held. Japanese engineers had waterproofed the critical sections, creating spaces that could withstand not just bombardment, but the ocean itself, pressing down from above. They found barracks here, wooden bunks for 80 men, ventilation adequate for long-term occupation, supplies sufficient for 6 months. The Japanese hadn't planned for a brief defense. They'd built infrastructure for sustained operations. If the invasion had failed, defenders could have remained underground indefinitely, surfacing only to man weapons positions. That single defensive network multiplied across the island. Within 76 hours, 500 interconnected positions discovered. The entire conception of amphibious warfare had to be rewritten. Colonel David Shoup commanded the 2nd Marines during the assault. Blood-soaked and exhausted, he stood on the 3rd day examining a captured engineer's diary. The text detailed construction methods, tunnel depths, ventilation calculations. Shoup had graduated from DePaul University with a degree in mathematics. The numbers told him something intelligence officers were only beginning to grasp. Traditional naval bombardment attacked horizontal targets, bunkers, gun positions, troop concentrations on the surface. 3-dimensional fortifications required 3-dimensional solutions. The Navy could flatten every building on Betio and still leave underground positions intact. Artillery shells detonated on impact. They couldn't penetrate 15 feet of concrete and coral before exploding. What doctrine didn't account for? Vertical defensive depth made conventional bombardment obsolete. Within 30 days, ordnance experts would test 27 different explosive combinations, seeking weapons that could reach underground positions. Major General Holland Smith, commanding V Amphibious Corps, flew to Betio on November 24th. He'd led Marine operations in the Pacific since Guadalcanal. Walking through the tunnels changed his understanding of Japanese defensive philosophy. The enemy had abandoned the water's edge strategy that failed in the Solomons. Instead, they'd created killing zones where invaders had to advance under fire from positions impervious to supporting arms. Smith convened his staff that evening aboard the Maryland. 23 officers crowded the wardroom, studying maps and photographs. The discussion lasted 4 hours. Several conclusions emerged immediately. First, aerial reconnaissance couldn't detect underground construction. Second, naval gunfire needed fundamental revision. Third, new weapons were essential for reducing fortified positions that existing ordnance couldn't touch. Commander Draper Kaufman represented the Navy's underwater demolition teams. His divers had reconnoitered Betio's reef barriers before the invasion, but their mission focused on obstacles below the waterline. Underground tunnels hadn't been part of pre-invasion planning. Now Kaufman proposed expanding UDT responsibilities to include detecting ventilation shafts, tunnel entrances, and other indicators of subsurface construction. The technical challenge seemed insurmountable. Japanese engineers had camouflaged tunnel openings as natural coral formations. Ventilation shafts emerged through existing vegetation. Surface indicators required trained observers who understood what subtle terrain features might conceal. Nobody in the fleet possessed that expertise yet. How could assault forces neutralize defenses they couldn't see? The solution required inventing detection methods and weapons that didn't exist in any military's arsenal. Engineers studied the tunnel construction in detail. Japanese workers had excavated coral using hand tools and explosives, creating passages tall enough for men to walk upright. Steel beams every 10 feet supported the roof. Concrete poured over wooden forms created smooth walls that channeled ventilation efficiently. The sophistication implied months of planning by officers trained in military engineering. Lieutenant Colonel Presley Rixey commanded the 1st Battalion, 10th Marines, the division's artillery regiment. His 75mm pack howitzers had fired over reef barriers during the assault, suppressing visible targets. Underground positions had been immune. Rixey calculated that even 105mm shells lacked penetration capability against 15 feet of overhead protection. The largest caliber weapons in the Marine arsenal, 8-inch howitzers, might reach depths of 20 feet if they hit precisely above a chamber, but blind firing at suspected locations would waste ammunition and time. The numbers seemed impossible. Conventional explosives required 6 times their current power to reliably penetrate Japanese defensive depth, but ordnance laboratories at Aberdeen Proving Ground would confirm these calculations within weeks. Captain Kenneth Holand led G Company, 2nd Marines, through the final assault on Bonnyman's bunker complex. His company had lost 59 men, 40% casualties, taking positions that should have been destroyed by preliminary bombardment. Walking through the tunnels afterward, Holand understood why. The bunker he'd attacked from above was actually the firing position for an underground complex housing 40 defenders. When Americans destroyed the surface structure, Japanese simply retreated down stairways and emerged from exits 50 yards away. Holand's after-action report identified a pattern. Japanese defenders used the tunnels to mass forces at critical points. When Marines broke through one sector, defenders reinforced from underground reserves Americans couldn't observe. The tunnel network functioned as interior lines of communication far more effective than surface trenches. Destroying one position accomplished nothing if defenders could simply relocate. While Marine engineers mapped tunnels, ordnance experts began experimenting with new explosive compounds. Traditional TNT and amytal provided excellent blast effects against surface targets, but lacked the crushing force needed to collapse reinforced concrete chambers. Research focused on increasing explosive density and detonation velocity, factors that determine penetration capability. The solution emerged through a combination of explosive types. Torpex, developed for underwater use, generated 50% more force than TNT. Composition B, a mixture of RDX and TNT, offered similar advantages. Both explosives had been manufactured for naval torpedoes and depth charges. Adapting them to land warfare required new delivery systems, larger satchel charges, pole charges for placing explosives directly against concrete, and eventually flamethrower tank variants that could inject burning fuel into tunnel openings. Could engineers develop weapons fast enough to affect battles scheduled for early 1944? The timeline seemed impossibly compressed. Testing began at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton in December 1943. Engineers constructed replicas of Tarawa's bunkers using similar concrete thicknesses and overhead coverage. Demolition teams experimented with charge placement, explosive weight, and detonation timing. Initial results disappointed. Even 50-pound Torpex charges placed directly against concrete walls failed to penetrate chambers 15 feet deep. The breakthrough came from studying Japanese construction methods. Tunnel systems required ventilation shafts connecting to the surface. These shafts, though narrow, created structural weak points. Lowering explosives down ventilation shafts placed charges inside the defensive network. Detonation from within collapsed chambers far more effectively than external attacks. The challenge became detecting and accessing these camouflaged openings during combat. Lieutenant Thomas Dyer commanded the 2nd Engineer Battalion's demolition platoon. His teams had used satchel charges and pole charges to reduce surface bunkers during the assault. Post-battle examination revealed that most charges had killed defenders through overpressure and fragmentation, but hadn't destroyed the structures themselves. Japanese engineers emerged from underground positions after the explosions passed, reoccupied firing positions, and resumed fighting. Dyer proposed systematic clearance procedures. Identify all entrances and exits, seal secondary openings with explosives, pump smoke into the primary entrance to verify tunnel extent, then lower demolition charges through ventilation shafts at multiple points. Simultaneous detonation would collapse the entire complex rather than individual chambers. The method required time and careful coordination, luxuries rarely available during combat. Japanese defensive doctrine documented. Interconnected positions provide mutual support and allow tactical flexibility under bombardment. The problem: American forces had no doctrine for attacking three-dimensional fortifications systematically. Major General Julian Smith appointed a special board to study tunnel warfare. The board included engineers, infantry officers, demolition experts, and intelligence specialists. Their mission: develop tactical procedures for detecting, mapping, and reducing underground defensive networks. The board's recommendations would form the basis for amphibious assault doctrine used throughout the Central Pacific Campaign. Could traditional infantry tactics adapt to fighting an enemy who could appear anywhere from below? The question challenged fundamental assumptions about linear defenses and front lines. The board's first conclusion addressed intelligence collection. Aerial reconnaissance had to expand beyond photographing surface features. Interpreters needed training to recognize signs of underground construction, disturbed coral, ventilation shaft camouflage, unusual vegetation patterns. Submarines conducting pre-invasion reconnaissance should include observers trained in military engineering. Even subtle indicators might reveal defensive networks before assault forces landed. Second, the board recommended quadrupling engineer assets assigned to Marine divisions. Tarawa demonstrated that reducing fortified positions required specialized training and equipment beyond standard infantry capabilities. Each assault battalion needed an attached engineer platoon equipped with demolitions, flamethrowers, and bulldozers. These units would form specialized tunnel clearance teams. Third, fire support doctrine required complete revision. Naval gunfire couldn't destroy underground positions, but could be used more effectively. Rather than area bombardment, ships should target specific buildings and surface structures identified through reconnaissance. Destroying buildings prevented their use as firing positions and exposed tunnel entrances. Sustained fire over days rather than hours would force defenders to remain underground, depleting their supplies and exhausting personnel. The technical challenge remained. No weapon existed that could reliably destroy deep bunkers without infantry closing to point-blank range. That meant casualties, potentially heavy casualties, on every defended island between Tarawa and Japan. January 1944, Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Captain Carl Hoffman supervised construction of a mock Japanese fortress. Engineers poured concrete following specifications captured at Tarawa. Tunnels descended 20 feet, connected 5 reinforced chambers, included ventilation shafts every 30 feet. The project consumed 3 weeks and cost $47,000. Money the Marine Corps diverted from training ammunition. The complex replicated Tarawa's engineering exactly. 4-foot-thick walls, 10 feet of overhead cover, steel reinforcement matching Japanese specifications. Combat cameramen documented every stage of construction. The resulting structure would serve as the proving ground for new tactics that had to work before Kwajalelin Atoll came under assault in February. What seemed like unnecessary expense? 3 weeks, building a training target. But within 60 days, techniques developed here would save hundreds of Marine lives. 1st Demolition Platoon, 18th Marines, arrived on January 15th. 26 men commanded by Lieutenant James Russell. Russell had fought at Tarawa, watched bunkers absorb satchel charges without collapsing, seen defenders emerge from smoke and dust to kill Marines who thought positions were cleared. His mission now, develop reliable methods for destroying underground complexes using weapons available to rifle companies. Russell's team began with standard approaches. A 40-pound satchel charge placed against the concrete entrance. The explosion sent fragments skyward, cracked the facing, penetrated 3 inches. Defenders inside would have been stunned, possibly wounded, definitely still combat effective. The tunnel remained intact. They doubled the charge, 80 pounds of composition B. The blast created a crater 2 feet deep, destroyed the entrance completely, but failed to collapse the tunnel beyond. Debris blocked the opening, but could be cleared by determined defenders within an hour. Cost per charge, $340. Marines would need multiple charges per position. The math didn't work. What Marine training had never addressed. Vertical fortifications required fundamentally different approaches than surface targets. Russell studied the ventilation system. Shafts emerged through camouflaged grills, 50 feet from the main entrance. He lowered a 30-pound charge down the nearest shaft, placed it at tunnel level, detonated. The explosion vented upward through the shaft. Spectacular, but ineffective. The charge needed containment to direct force into the chamber. The solution came from battlefield improvisation at Tarawa. Staff Sergeant Norman Thomas had stuffed sandbags into a ventilation shaft after lowering explosives, creating a plug that directed blast force downward. The resulting explosion collapsed a section of tunnel, trapping defenders inside connected chambers. Thomas received a Bronze Star. More importantly, his technique became standard procedure. Testing continued through late January. Engineers varied charge weights, placement depths, and timing. Optimal results required 50 pounds of composition B per ventilation shaft, lowered to tunnel depth, stemmed with sandbags, detonated simultaneously at multiple points. 4 charges could collapse a 5-chamber complex in 90 seconds. The method worked. When Marines could locate all ventilation shafts before Japanese defenders realized what was happening. Second test phase examined flamethrowers. The M22 flamethrower projected burning fuel 130 feet, but lacked penetration through narrow openings. Sergeant William Walsh modified the weapon, removing the pressure regulator to increase range. His modification, technically unauthorized, extended effective range to 180 feet. More critically, it allowed sustained burns into tunnel entrances, consuming oxygen and creating carbon monoxide that permeated connected chambers. The modification seemed dangerous. Higher pressure increased risk of backfire or fuel tank failure. But field testing proved the concept worked without catastrophic failures. Walsh demonstrated the modified flamethrower against the mock fortress. A 30-second burn into the main entrance filled the tunnel with flame and smoke. Smoke emerged from ventilation shafts 50 feet away, confirming the network's interconnected nature. Inside, target dummies showed heat damage consistent with fatal burns. Even defenders in the deepest chamber would face lethal temperatures or carbon monoxide poisoning. Flame warfare posed its own challenges. Each M22 carried fuel for 10 seconds of continuous burning. Clearing a tunnel network required multiple flamethrower teams, careful coordination, and infantry support to protect the operators. Japanese snipers had killed several flamethrower operators at Tarawa, easy targets carrying distinctive equipment. Doctrine needed to address survivability alongside effectiveness. January 28th, 1st Battalion, 4th Marines, conducted the first unit-level exercise against the mock fortress. Companies rotated through the problem. Approach under simulated fire. Identify all entrances and shafts. Coordinate engineer support. Reduce the position without excessive casualties. Initial attempts failed spectacularly. Able Company assaulted directly. Simulated machine gun fire from observation slits killed 1/3 of the unit before they reached the entrance. Those who made it used satchel charges against the main door. The entrance survived, while attackers absorbed casualties from flanking positions. After-action review. Frontal assault against reinforced tunnels guaranteed prohibitive losses. Baker Company tried suppressive fire, pinning defenders inside with rifle and machine gun fire while engineers moved forward. The approach worked better but still cost 15% casualties. Engineers reached ventilation shafts, placed charges, achieved demolition. Elapsed time, 47 minutes. At Tarawa, Japanese defenders had used such delays to reinforce from adjacent positions. Charlie Company integrated tanks with infantry. 2 M4A2 Shermans suppressed observation slits with 75mm high explosive, while riflemen covered engineers. Demolition teams worked systematically. Locate shafts, place charges, stem with sandbags, detonate simultaneously. The position collapsed in 14 minutes, with 6% simulated casualties. The method showed promise, but required combined arms coordination most rifle companies hadn't practiced. How could Marines perfect these techniques before the next invasion? Training time was measured in days, not weeks. Third test phase focused on detection. Intelligence officers studied aerial photographs of Tarawa taken before the invasion, searching for indicators they'd missed. Disturbed coral showed as slightly darker patches in high-resolution images. Ventilation shafts created shadows inconsistent with natural coral formations. Camouflaged entrances often featured vegetation patterns that didn't match surrounding growth. None of these indicators was definitive, but collectively they suggested subsurface construction. Photo interpretation teams trained at Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point. Instructors showed them hundreds of images, teaching recognition patterns. Students practiced identifying features that might indicate tunnels, bunkers, or underground storage. The training improved detection rates from 20% to 65%. Still inadequate, but better than relying on bombardment alone. Could submarines contribute to pre-invasion reconnaissance? The Navy explored using periscope observations to identify shoreline features aerial photography missed. Lieutenant Commander Roy Benson commanded the submarine Trigger. His boat had conducted pre-invasion reconnaissance before Tarawa, photographing beach obstacles and reef formations. Now he received training in military engineering principles. What to look for when observing enemy fortifications. Concrete positions required enormous material shipments. Disturbed beaches, unusual barge traffic, construction materials visible near defensive positions, all suggested major engineering projects. Benson practiced observation techniques off Saipan in February 1944. His periscope observations identified 14 suspected tunnel entrances invisible in aerial photographs. Subsequent intelligence confirmed 11 of those locations contained underground facilities. The success rate validated the concept but highlighted limitations. Submarines risked detection spending extended periods near enemy shores. They couldn't observe interior positions far from water. The technique complemented aerial reconnaissance but couldn't replace it. Fourth test phase addressed command and control. Tunnel clearance required coordinating infantry, engineers, tanks, and fire support. Radio communications often failed inside concrete structures. Hand signals worked only within visual range. Smoke and dust during combat obscured visual contact. Standard platoon communication methods broke down. Major Samuel Griffith proposed colored smoke grenades to mark progress. Yellow smoke indicated a position under attack. Green confirmed clearance. Red signaled casualties requiring evacuation. The color system allowed commanders observing from elevated positions to track multiple teams simultaneously. Testing proved the concept effective, provided someone maintained observation and smoke colors remained visible through battle debris. The refinement process continued through early February. Each innovation addressed specific problems observed at Tarawa. Collectively, they formed a systematic approach to tunnel warfare, but doctrine on paper differed from execution under fire. Marines would test these techniques against Japanese defenders at Kwajalelin, Inuit, and beyond. Lives depended on getting the methods right. February 1st, 1944. 8:30 hours. Staff Sergeant William Bordelum crouched behind a shattered palm log on Namur Island, Kwajalelin Atoll. He led the engineer section attached to 2nd Battalion, 24th Marines. Intelligence photographs showed 27 suspected tunnel complexes on Namur. Bordelon's mission reduced the defensive network before it could replicate Tarawa's casualties. The pre-invasion bombardment had lasted 2 days, triple Tarawa's duration. Naval guns had fired 7,000 shells at Namur's square mile. Carrier aircraft had dropped 2,000 bombs. Yet when Marines landed, machine gun fire erupted from positions that should have been obliterated. Japanese defenders emerged from underground shelters, manned intact weapons, contested every yard. Bordelon's team identified their first target at 0850 hours. A concrete structure 30 feet square, walls partially collapsed from naval gunfire, but the foundation intact. 2 observation slits faced the beach. Smoke emerging from behind the structure suggested ventilation from below. Battalion intelligence estimated 20-40 defenders inside, connected to adjacent positions through tunnels. His squad included 6 Marines trained at Camp Lejeune. Corporal James Day carried demolition charges, 50 pounds of Composition B divided into 5 bags. Private First Class Donald Gagnon operated a modified M22 flamethrower. The others carried rifles, covering the specialists as they worked. Could these new techniques succeed where Tarawa's methods had failed? They would know within minutes. Day led the approach. 2 riflemen suppressed the observation slits with automatic weapons fire while he moved forward. Japanese defenders didn't return fire. Lesson learned from Tarawa. Exposing themselves to rifle fire achieved nothing. They waited for targets that mattered. Flamethrower operators, demolition teams, officers directing the assault. Gagnon reached the structure's left side at 09:07 hours. His modified flamethrower projected fuel, 180 feet, but he closed to 40 yards for accuracy. The first burst hit the observation slit directly. Burning gasoline splashed through the opening, ignited inside the bunker. Screams echoed from within. Brief, then silence, but the structure stood. Defenders in the tunnel below remained unharmed. Day circled the position, looking for ventilation shafts. He found 3 within 50 feet. Camouflaged grills covered openings 8 inches square. He pulled the first grill free, lowered a 25-pound charge down the shaft on a rope. The charge dropped 18 feet before hitting bottom. Day plugged the opening with sandbags, moved to the second shaft, repeated the process. Third shaft, same procedure. Elapsed time, 11 minutes. Japanese defenders realized what was happening. Rifle fire cracked from adjacent positions. One round hit Day's pack, destroying his canteen. Another struck Private Robert Reed through the shoulder. Reed fell, bleeding, but stayed conscious. The rest of the team pulled him behind cover while Day completed preparations. 3 charges armed, 3 firing lines connected to a detonator. Day called the warning, "Fire in the hole." The detonator clicked. 3 simultaneous explosions vented through the shafts. The ground heaved. The concrete structure settled, cracking along the foundation. Smoke poured from every opening. Inside, the tunnel network collapsed, burying defenders under tons of coral and concrete. Bordel's team moved forward. Gagnon sprayed burning fuel through the shattered observation slit, ensuring no survivors. They found none. The position was thoroughly destroyed, its defenders dead or trapped beyond rescue. Cost: 11 minutes, 1 wounded. Marine: 75 pounds of explosives. At Tarawa, reducing similar positions had required hours and dozens of casualties. That single successful demolition multiplied across Namur. Within 8 hours, 27 tunnel complexes destroyed using identical methods. Japanese defensive coordination collapsed when command bunkers fell. Morning turned to afternoon. The 24th Marines advanced methodically, using the Camp Lejeune techniques at each defensive position. Tank infantry teams suppressed observation ports, while engineers located ventilation shafts. Flamethrowers cleared surface structures. Demolition charges collapsed underground chambers. The systematic approach worked when Japanese defenders allowed Marines time to execute. At 14:35 hours, Lieutenant Thomas Reeves led 3rd Platoon against a complex near Namur's northern tip. Intelligence indicated this was a command post, possibly housing the island's senior officers. The position featured 4 concrete structures connected by covered trenches and presumably tunnels underneath. Reeves followed doctrine: identify all entrances, locate ventilation shafts, coordinate supporting arms. His forward observers called naval gunfire against the visible structures. 5-inch shells from the destroyer. Schroeder pounded the concrete for 20 minutes. The surface buildings disintegrated, but defenders below remained protected. Engineers moved forward at 15:02 hours. They found ventilation shafts, began placing charges. Then Japanese counterattacked. 60 defenders emerged from a concealed tunnel exit 40 yards behind the Marine position. They'd remained underground during the bombardment, waited until Americans committed to the assault, then struck from an unexpected direction. The counterattack hit Reeves's platoon from behind. Machine gun fire cut down 8 Marines in the first burst. Riflemen turned to meet the threat, but faced disciplined enemy troops fighting from prepared positions. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Reeves called for reinforcements, while his Marines fought at close quarters with an enemy that had appeared from nowhere. How many more tunnel exits remained hidden? The question haunted every officer who'd studied Tarawa's maps. Corporal Day led his team toward the fighting. They reached Reeves's position at 15:18 hours, took cover behind a destroyed bunker. Day observed the tactical situation. Japanese controlled a low-rise 30 yards away, fired from partial defilade, clearly had good fields of fire. The tunnel exit was visible now, a 4-foot opening in a coral outcrop, camouflaged until defenders emerged. Day grabbed a flamethrower from a wounded operator. The weapon still held fuel for 6 seconds. He crawled forward, using destroyed buildings for cover, close to 35 yards. Japanese riflemen spotted him, concentrated fire. Rounds kicked up coral dust inches from his face. He kept moving. At 25 yards, Day rose and triggered the flamethrower. Burning fuel arced toward the tunnel entrance, splashed across the opening, ignited defenders emerging from below. Men staggered backward, clothes aflame, screaming. Day held the trigger. sweeping the nozzle across the entrance until fuel exhausted. The counterattack broke. Surviving Japanese retreated underground or died trying. Reeves' Marines regrouped. Engineers placed demolition charges in the tunnel entrance they had just cleared. The explosion collapsed 40 feet of passage, trapping defenders in chambers beyond. Those who'd survived the flamethrower died buried in coral and concrete. The command post fell at 15:47 hours, 45 minutes after the first shot. Day received the Medal of Honor posthumously, killed by a sniper 2 hours later while clearing another position. His innovations at Camp Lejeune, combined with extraordinary courage under fire, had proven the new tactics worked, but they still cost lives. Darkness approached at 1800 hours. Colonel Franklin Hart, commanding the 24th Marines, assessed progress. His regiment had advanced 700 yards, reduced 19 major defensive complexes, secured Namur's eastern half. Casualties totaled 44 killed, 147 wounded, heavy but far below Tarawa's rates. The new tactics were working. Japanese tunnel warfare, which had seemed invincible 2 months earlier, could be defeated through systematic application of fire, maneuver, and engineering. Night brought different challenges. Japanese defenders emerged from tunnels under cover of darkness, infiltrated marine lines, attacked command posts and artillery positions. Standing doctrine called for defensive perimeters and illumination fire. But Namur's terrain, dense with destroyed buildings and flooded shell craters, limited visibility even with flares. Sergeant Norman Thomas commanded an outpost 50 yards forward of the main line. His 8-man squad occupied a destroyed bunker, watching for infiltrators. At 22:47 hours, Thomas heard movement, boots scraping on concrete, whispered voices in Japanese. He signaled his Marines to remain silent, listening. The sounds came from below. Thomas realized Japanese defenders were moving through a tunnel that passed beneath his position. The tunnel connected rear areas to forward defensive complexes that hadn't been fully cleared. Enemy troops were using the network exactly as doctrine predicted. Interior lines allowing reinforcement and counterattack from unexpected directions. Thomas made a decision that violated standing orders. He pulled a thermite grenade from his pack, dropped it down a ventilation shaft 5 feet from his fighting hole. The grenade fell, detonated at tunnel level. White-hot thermite ignited everything combustible, sent temperature inside the tunnel above 4,000 degrees. Screams echoed up through the shaft. Movement sounds stopped. By dawn, engineers counted 23 Japanese bodies in the tunnel section beneath Thomas's outpost. The impromptu attack had killed a reinforcement unit before it could reach forward positions. Thomas received a Silver Star. More importantly, his action demonstrated that Marines were adapting faster than Japanese could adjust their tactics. February 2nd, operations continued. The 24th Marines secured Namur completely by 1200 hours. Final casualty count, 208 killed, 576 wounded from a regimental strength of 3,400. The ratio, 6% killed versus 19% at Tarawa, proved the new methods reduced losses significantly. Japanese defenders fought with equal determination but couldn't compensate for American technical and tactical superiority. Colonel Hart walked the battlefield that afternoon. Destroyed tunnel complexes dotted Namur's landscape, concrete rubble, collapsed earth, ventilation shafts torn open by demolitions. Engineers estimated the Japanese had constructed 400 interconnected positions over 8 months. The defensive network rivaled Tarawa in sophistication and exceeded it in scale, yet Marines had reduced the entire system in 40 hours. What made the difference? Hart's after-action report identified key factors: extended pre-invasion bombardment that destroyed surface structures and exposed tunnel entrances, systematic clearance procedures that prevented piecemeal attacks, integration of tanks, flamethrowers, and demolitions at platoon level, improved intelligence that detected underground construction before the assault. But the human factor mattered most. Marines at Kwajalelin knew what awaited them. They'd studied Tarawa's lessons, trained for tunnel warfare, understood the enemy's methods. Fear remained. Every man wondered if he'd survive the day, but fear no longer paralyzed. They had techniques that worked, weapons that killed, and leaders who wouldn't waste their lives in futile frontal assaults. The tunnel networks that shocked Marines at Tarawa became routine obstacles at Kwajalelin. What seemed impossible in November looked solvable in February. Japanese defensive engineering still killed Americans, but no longer at rates that threatened operational success. The tactical revolution born from Tarawa's coral reefs had matured into doctrine that would carry Marines across the Pacific to Japan itself. From November 1943 through August 1945, Marines assaulted 26 Japanese-held islands across the Central Pacific. Engineers documented underground defensive networks on 24 of those islands. The total exceeded 8,700 interconnected positions, concrete bunkers, tunnels, command posts, and supply chambers designed to withstand naval bombardment. Tarawa's shock had become the expected standard. This represented a complete transformation of amphibious warfare doctrine within 21 months. The numbers seemed impossible. Japanese engineers had constructed fortifications equivalent to 170 miles of connected tunnels, but post-war surveys confirmed every measurement. Marine casualties declined as tactics improved. Tarawa cost 19% of the assault force killed or wounded in 76 hours. Kwajalelin dropped to 6%. Saipan, despite 3 weeks of fighting and more extensive Japanese defenses, produced 8% casualties. Iwo Jima's 26% rate reflected the island's unique volcanic terrain and unprecedented defensive density, 22,000 defenders in 21 miles of tunnels, rather than tactical failure. The techniques developed after Tarawa worked consistently across varied terrain and enemy defensive schemes. Strategic impact rippled through American military doctrine. Tunnel warfare forced the Navy to extend pre-invasion bombardments from hours to days. Destroyers expended entire ammunition loads, suppressing positions that aerial photography had identified. The requirement consumed time, and time allowed Japanese defenders to prepare. But the alternative, landing against intact defenses, guaranteed casualties that would have broken public support for the offensive. Could a different approach have avoided Tarawa's losses entirely? Admiral Spruance argued that bypassing heavily defended atolls was strategically sound, but the argument missed the point. Japanese would fortify every island within bomber range of American advance. Learning tunnel warfare at Tarawa, where mistakes cost 1,000 lives, prepared Marines for Saipan, where errors might have cost 10,000. The harsh calculus of island warfare offered no gentle learning curve. Tank infantry coordination evolved from Tarawa's lessons. Pre-invasion doctrine separated armor and riflemen, using tanks as mobile artillery firing from rear positions. Tunnel warfare required tanks advancing with infantry, suppressing observation slits at point-blank range while engineers worked. By Iwo Jima, Marine divisions integrated tank platoons down to company level, creating combined arms teams that could reduce fortifications systematically. Flamethrower tactics matured through brutal experience. The M22 flamethrower proved effective but vulnerable. Japanese targeted operators ruthlessly. Development of the M4A3R3 Zippo tank mounted flamethrowers on Sherman chassis, providing armor protection and greater fuel capacity. These vehicles could burn tunnel entrances for minutes rather than seconds, consuming oxygen throughout connected chambers. At Iwo Jima, 8 flame tanks supported the 5th Marine Division, reducing 70 major cave complexes that conventional weapons couldn't touch. Engineering innovations accelerated. Composition,